All right, thank you to Kenneth for wrapping up the session here. So I'm just going to provide a few brief comments. So I'm John Hackney. I'm from the University of Arkansas. Everything in Arkansas I'm learning is named the Walton something. So I'm at the Walton College of Business, and I'm slowly assimilating there. So I've had the great privilege of being a part of this conference now a few times. This is actually my third time, and I went back into the archives, which are thankfully online. And here I am as a baby academic in 2017, presenting a paper about SBA lending in the financial crisis. And I'm no longer wearing glasses, so you can tell the time has passed. I'm also a lot more spry in that picture. This picture was useful because I was about to pack that same shirt and tie. So I've also diversified, but it's great to be back. The conference, having been here now for almost 10 years, it's gotten better and better each year. So I commend the organizers for just keeping this going and improving it year over year. Okay, so my task here is I'm going to try to synthesize what everybody has said, and I'm going to take a little bit different perspective. So the authors, did a great job of summarizing their work, and I'm going to say what it made me think of. And I know, when you first hear about technology, it always gives me this sense of foreboding, especially with AI. You feel like you're in the Terminator movie, the machines are coming for us. I hope by the end of this session you actually have some glimmers of hope. So I think some of my takeaways from the paper will show that community banks are still really important. That's going to be the theme that underlies all of my comments here. So I want to start by just showing you a list of just very recent articles about small business lending and technology. Ironically enough, this list was generated by AI, right? You can go and you can ask, what have been all of the articles that have been written on this topic? Okay, and this is an AI system that's actually plugged into the internet, so it's not going to give me fake ones. Here we have, this is a very salient issue. This is an issue that's very much so in the news. It's in everybody's frame of reference, and so this is important. It's important for us as academics to look at. Community banks are obviously dealing with this on the ground, and then for regulators to think about. Okay, so now just let me go through and talk about each of the papers. Okay, the other thing that I did was I used AI to generate some images. All right, so if you plug the paper titles into AI and say, give me an image that represents this paper title, here you go. This is the first one. This looks a little bit different from Bill's branch, but maybe Bill, this is the future. Some futuristic, computer, a lot of touch screens, that's what I'm seeing. But the first paper is dealing with US banks' artificial intelligence. And what's really cool about this paper, and for us as academics, what gets us excited is data. Okay? And so what Jeff was able to do is get actually the banks behind these surveys and then be able to analyze them and then their lending activities. So the big question is, does AI use actually spur small business lending? And then if so, how and when? And I think a question that's kind of lurking in the background of this, and one that's of particular relevance to the community bankers in the audience, is can AI approximate or intuit the sort of soft information that's been the cornerstone of the lending model for community banks? Right? We're always kind of curious, are the machines going to be able to figure this out? All these person-to-person relationships, are they getting closer? And so I think that question is kind of just in the background of this paper as well. Okay? And the main findings. So the first is that AI does increase lending, but importantly, it's only to distant geographies. And I think that distant geographies is really important because we know, both from academic research and from your lived experience, those distant loans are the ones that are going to be based more so on quantifiable hard information. Right? You can't make a soft information loan to some place that's far away because you don't have that soft information. Right? And so that, I think, has really important implications for the types of loans and the types of lending that AI is able to help with. Okay? So that's the big key takeaway. Okay? And from a policy perspective, what's nice, and Kenneth noted this as well, the findings are more pronounced in these underserved areas, right? And I think this is actually going to point to another important implication. So areas that are generally poor, areas with fewer banks, that's where you're going to see this effect the strongest, right? And what's also going to be true of those markets, if you have no local banks, you're going to have no production of local soft information, right? So to me, these first two takeaways are, or these first two findings are pointing towards the importance still of soft information, even in this world of AI, right? So where is AI able to penetrate the market when there's no local banks producing the soft information, right? Okay, another thing is, AI appears to be doing a good job of identifying creditworthy borrowers. And then finally, and again, of particular relevance to this group, AI use is more prevalent in larger banks. Okay, so I think those are the big takeaways from this paper. Okay, so what this immediately made me think of, and I've already stated this, is the local banks are still really important here. So when you have local banks, I think one of the implications of Jeff's paper is you don't have the AI loans being made, right? So in that sense, they're not substituting for those local bank loans. Okay, so this is where the hope comes in. So hopefully you feel that hope rising in you now. Okay, what does AI do? Well, it facilitates the use of hard information, right? So it allows you to reach these areas where there are no banks without replacing the soft information. And then I think another really important thing, I haven't really wrapped my head around what this means, is there's not an increase in overall small business lending. It's very much so distant lending goes up, but overall small business lending does not, right? So there seems to be maybe a sort of a shift in where the lending is taking place, and maybe that's because AI can't replace the local lending. Maybe it's replacing distant lending. I don't know, good implications to think about. And related to that, and this question was brought up in one of the earlier sessions, so I've done work with CRA data, with thinking about CRA regulation. I think all of these papers are going to have really interesting implications for the CRA, for how we think about regulating banks and their lending, right? So AI is allowing all this distant lending. We're kind of breaking the boundaries of the branch and its importance for small business lending. So how should we adjust regulation in light of this new world? Okay. All right, paper 2. I really like this AI-generated image. I feel like it nailed it for you, Christina. So you can take this. If you plug this title in to the AI generation, this is what it gives you. So when regulation meets technology, there they are. They're meeting. They're shaking hands. Okay. So this paper gives a really nice overview of how small business lending has evolved over the past 2 decades, right? That's what this paper is all about. And as Christina noted, the real strength of this paper is the data. And so Yannick pointed it out yesterday. We don't have a credit registry here. This is as close as we can get. And what's nice about it is you can look through that data, and you're not only getting banks, but you're getting all these other non-banks. And you can then assess what is the importance of those non-banks in small business lending over time. And then you can think about interactions like, well, we know that the large banks are facing increased regulation. How is that affecting the market share of all these non-bank lenders? And then, Kenneth and I were talking before the session of how should we think about regulating all these non-bank lenders? If lending is shifting towards them, what are the implications of that for the overall economy? Okay, so the key findings. Fintechs are becoming more important. I think we kind of sense this, at least anecdotally. The data bears that out. Okay, large banks are retreating from this market. Fintechs, to some extent, are stepping in. Importantly, again, from a policy perspective, this wasn't disproportionate in underserved areas. So large banks just kind of pulled back in general. Okay? And another thing that should give some hope, pre-existing relationships, they still matter. I know this from my personal experience. My parents have a small business in Spokane, Washington. Long-time relationship with a community bank. They had an SBA loan with them, and when PPP hit, they got a loan immediately, right? So I know, my personal experience bears this out as well. And then I think one result that Christina was not able to get to, but has really interesting implications, is all these different types of lenders, they're still doing different things, right? They're concentrating in different types of industries with different collateral types, which, they're not perfect substitutes for each other, which is important to keep in mind. Okay, so again, one of the takeaways from this paper, the local banks are still important. And Christina mentioned this. One of the things that happens when the large banks retreat, one of the findings is the other banks, they step in. Okay, so the local banks are still doing something that's very important. One of the important policy implications that she did point out is, given this overall shift in the small business credit market towards non-bank lenders, if there's another emergency situation like COVID, we're going to have to consider how to maybe involve these lenders if that's who small businesses are working with. That may be an unpopular opinion in this room. Another thing, if you look at the data, and again, I think this kind of gets to the segmentation of the market between the banks and the non-bank lenders, you still don't have the alternative lenders present in a lot of counties. So just looking at the different sample sizes, for certain types of lenders, they're just not present in certain areas. And I think it's worth thinking about how and why that's the case. And that could be related to the fact that maybe if a fintech works with certain types of businesses, they're simply not present there. Demand supply effects, I think, is worth considering. And again, if we get this shift to small business lending towards non-bank lenders, what does that mean for our lending regulations? All right. So finally, for Tong's paper, I'm not sure if this is open banking. Tong, maybe we should open the safe in the next iteration of this image. That's what AI thinks it should look like. So how does open access banking affect access to credit for small businesses? Right? That's the big question here. Okay, the key findings. So, and it makes intuitive sense. If you allow the banks to have more data, that's going to allow them to increase lending, right? And it increases the pledgeability of assets that were previously hard to collateralize, like accounts receivable and inventory. Okay, so greater access to credit. And another result that I don't think Tong mentioned, but I think is particularly important, is who is this beneficial for? Not only small businesses, but young firms. So there's this general finding in the academic literature that it's not just the small businesses that drive economic growth in the US, it's really the young small businesses that are doing it, right? So if you find this result specifically or especially for the young firms, I think that has important economic implications. All right, so what are the implications? So open banking, it reduces banks' information monopoly. That's a line I take from Tong's paper, and he touched on this a bit at the end. The banks don't like this, and Kenneth pointed out a reason why. Maybe we just need a secure way to share this data. But I think it's also worth thinking about, from the bank perspective, how does this affect incentives? Right? If you know that all this data is going to be shared, that used to be data you could use, how does that affect your incentives to invest in the relationship? And I think it could go either way. Maybe now you're going to invest in the more soft information side that can't be shared. Right? Maybe you invest less. It could go either way, but I think it's worth thinking from the bank perspective. If they know this will not be their data anymore, how does that affect incentives to produce information? Okay, and I think that would obviously be very different for small banks and large banks. I could see a situation where small banks are producing more soft information. Large banks don't do that, so maybe they just produce less information overall. I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing to do. And another result that Tong didn't talk about, but previous relationships are important, right? And I think we should have a counter on the back wall in this conference. Every time somebody says relationship, it just ticks up, right? And we're at like 157, I think. We know that relationships are important. And so in that sense, the banks that are producing this information, the local banks are still important. All right. So this is my big takeaway, which you have already seen through talking through all these papers. In my mind, technology as it exists now helps to process all this hard information. It makes it much more efficient. We can see that now it's going to increase lending in areas where banks don't have branches, which has important policy implications. However, right now, it doesn't seem like it's able to fully approximate or intuit soft information. Right? All of this has shown me that local banks are still important. Okay, so that's my big takeaway from these papers. I commend the authors on an incredible data effort. As somebody who deals with data a lot, they did a ton of work and a lot of work on causal relationships. So kudos to them. And now let me open it up for Q&A from the audience. Thank you.